The New York Times published a poll of Tea Party participants across the country. We do not spend a lot of time talking about polls on this show, especially polls of social movements that don't have formal membership and are pretty loosely defined. But there was one thing written up in that poll that has stuck with me that I can't really get out of my head. This is from the end of the New York Times synopsis of their findings. Nearly 3/4 of those who favor smaller government said they would prefer it even if it meant spending on domestic programs would be cut. But in follow-up interviews, I cannot get this out of my head. Tea Party supporters said they did not want to cut Medicare or Social Security, the biggest domestic programs, suggesting instead a focus on, quote, waste. That's a conundrum, isn't it? Asked Jodine White, age 62, of Rockland, California. I don't know what to say. Maybe I don't want smaller government. I guess I want smaller government and my Social Security. She added, I didn't look at it from the perspective of losing things I need. I think I've changed my mind. Right there on the spot, talking to the New York Times pollster. It's sort of perfect, isn't it? Whatever you think about the Tea Party protests and their tactics and how they get their message across, this right here has been one of the persistent centrist and liberal critiques of the Tea Party movement and this whole Obama-era anti-government uprising on the right. That sort of blatant, clear-as-day contradiction. Get your government hands off my Medicare. Get the government out of my life. Don't touch my Social Security. These are not apocryphal stories. I mean, made up by liberals, right? This lady really is wearing a taxpayer revolt t-shirt while holding a sign that reads, don't touch my Medicare. She's not a staffer on the show. We did not make her up. This guy really did direct people to throw bricks through the windows of Democratic Party offices to protest there being too much government while he is living on Social Security disability payments, which you might know are from the government. It's a contradiction that's present even in the way these folks choose to articulate their protest against the government. For example, the march on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., which even while it's being used as a staging ground for anti-government protesters, is a government-funded national park. Protesters last week inveighing against government encroachment on private property while standing on probably the most famous piece of public property in America. It even has a commie-sounding name, the Boston Common. Common, get it? One of the country's oldest national parks. On Monday, anti-government protesters showed off their right to bear arms in a government-funded state park in Virginia. You might remember when Tea Party folks converged on Washington, D.C. for the big 9/12 anti-government march last year. In addition to using a national park for the site of their protest, one of the great footnotes to that protest were the complaints by many 9/12 protesters that the public transportation system that they used in D.C. to get to their anti-government march, they didn't feel was up to their standards. Here's how we covered it at the time. Occasionally you come across something when you're reading the news that can't be improved upon with comment. So here, without comment, is from today's Wall Street Journal. Quote, protesters who attended Saturday's Tea Party rally in Washington are unhappy with the level of service provided by the subway system. Republican Congressman Kevin Brady asked for an explanation of why the government-run subway system didn't, in his view, adequately prepare for the rally to protest government spending and government services. Seriously. That's not me saying seriously. That's in the Wall Street Journal. The ostensibly principled position these folks are taking is that they want smaller government. They want government to do less. And just because so many of them are retired Medicare and Social Security recipients who get to their protests in national parks via public mass transit, don't let that get in the way of their anti-government message. When you are shown to demonstrably not believe something you say you believe, that's hypocrisy. And reasonably speaking, it should undermine your claim that you're acting on principle. You can't say you hate government-run health care, for example, and then profess your love for Medicare. It is one or the other, or you don't make any sense. In the case of the Tea Partiers, though, mainstream media coverage has been willing to almost assume that they're making sense, even in the face of evidence to the contrary. Because the idea of being in favor of smaller government, the idea that government is inherently wasteful and incompetent and should be shrunk, because that idea has shifted from a conservative movement talking point 30 years ago to centrist beltway common wisdom today, sometimes we don't even recognize the hypocrisy when it's right in our face. The conservative movement won the framing fight. It doesn't sound crazy anymore to rail against the federal government while standing in a national park, until you really think about it. I mean, imagine anyone protesting in favor of government. Imagine for a minute if people were actually out there protesting for government not to go away and shrink, but to be better, to stay the same size, or maybe even to do more. Imagine if people were protesting against cuts to government that were going to hurt their quality of life. It might not get as much airtime as the Tea Party anti-government protests, but that is, in fact, some of what's going on out there in America right now. If you were in Atlanta, Georgia today, you might have seen big mass transit buses and trains marked with giant red X's across them. Every bus or train with an X on it represented one that's scheduled to be cut from service as a result of the Atlanta transit system's massive budget deficit. The X's were drawn on by transit employees. In Cleveland, Ohio yesterday, hundreds of people jammed into a crowded school board meeting to protest that city's decision to lay off more than 500 teachers in order to make up a $53 million deficit. That decision is going to result in a 40-to-1 student-to-teacher ratio in Cleveland classrooms.
When does money precede education of our children?
In Springfield, Illinois today, thousands of people marched on the state capitol to argue, get this, to argue in favor of a tax increase in Illinois. In favor of a tax increase in Illinois so that cities in Illinois do not see the same type of teacher layoffs and mass transit cuts that places like Cleveland and Atlanta are already experiencing and already protesting. At the Save Our State march today in Illinois, people reportedly chanted to their lawmakers in unison, "Show some guts, show some guts." Similar protests have taken place in the past few weeks in places including Burbank, California, and Greenville, South Carolina. These are Americans who are arguing that what the government provides is important and they don't want it to be taken away. And they're arguing that when government has to be cut for financial reasons, there's real pain caused by that. Essentially, the people really need what government does. It's sort of the Tea Party, the anti-Tea Party. The anti Party? That's probably never going to catch on, even if the protests do. It doesn't necessarily fit the national media narrative that everybody hates the government now, but this is happening. It's a real thing. It should be reported on, too. Joining us now is Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell. He's the former chairman of the Democratic National Committee. Governor Rendell, thanks very much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
State and local governments are in dire straits right now. You and I have talked about that before on the show. We are seeing protests about mass transit cuts and teacher layoffs. What do you think the political impact is of the tough situation that cities and states are in and how people are reacting to it?
Well, I think you made a very central point in the early part of your narrative, and that's that the conservatives have won this argument, and they've certainly won it over the last 16, 17 months, in the fact that the Tea Party gets tremendous coverage. And think about it. Week before the health care vote, they had a rally in Washington, got 1,000 people, maybe not even that. The Tax Day rally, the big rally to protest federal taxes, got less than 1,500 people showing up, according to their own organizer. Other people thought it was in the 400 or 500 range. Gosh, if I had a rally in Washington to have stronger laws to protect puppies, we'd have 100,000 people without blinking. And yet the media, including the so-called liberal and progressive media, have given the Tea Partyites elevation in terms of the impact they're having on the national debate and discussion, way above what they deserve. And conversely, the rallies that you talked about, I think you'd have to look pretty hard tomorrow in the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Boston Herald, in any papers, to find those rallies covered. But people do understand, and by the way, I think we Democrats have not done a good job making our case. Education matters, and spending on education, spending for quality pre-K and full-day kindergarten, improves performance. Spending for after-school tutoring gets kids who are falling below proficiency levels in reading and math up to proficiency levels. But we haven't made our case very well. We Democrats, I think, are responsible in part for losing this debate over the last 16 or 17 months because we've been unable or unwilling to speak about or afraid to speak about what we believe in. That government, effectively managed and effectively implemented, can make a real difference